Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO Terragon series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, more specifically the Nintendo 64 core. Because with Analog 3D announced, a lot of people have been wanting to see more of these comparison videos, so we're going to be doing NSO versus the core versus the Ares emulator for software side of things, and it's going to be a really fun shootout. We're going to be doing 4 games talking about the differences, how they're similar, as well as which one I recommend. Before we get too far involved, it'd be a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It definitely helps us out. So right now you are watching the Ares footage, and I decided not to logos these up because I wanted you guys to really get a sense of what the screen looked like overall. Ares is 100% my recommended emulator if you're going to software emulate Nintendo 64. Obviously we move back over to NSO, and the big difference again is going to be the upscaling as far as the internal rendering resolution is concerned. NSO is going to give you a completely different look as far as the overall graphical nature of Nintendo 64, but it's definitely going to come with some screen cadence issues and some frame pacing problems where you're going to get hitches in certain games. But honestly, Ares is not immune to that either. It can have hitching every once in a while, not as much as the NSO core, but it's definitely something that you're going to have to deal with. And you'll see here as we kind of just take a look at Ares again, everything looks exactly like a Nintendo 64. As far as the look of software emulation versus MiSTer FPGA, these are basically identical. So if you took a screenshot of Ares, if you took a screenshot of the core, put them side by side, you wouldn't see any fundamental difference whatsoever. And in some games like Super Mario 64 here, it will rarely have ever hitched. So I would say that Ares and the core are basically doing the exact same thing, where NSO is the outlier with the upgraded graphics and some of that hitching involved. And you'll see here in Ares the overall graphical effect of the fog layer over the water when we're swimming underneath as Mario works. But when we go back to the NSO core, it just gets a little bit too sharp, it gets a little bit too clear, and while it is still an incredibly fun game because it is just Super Mario 64, it has that difference in overall image quality. And right here, NSO on the left, the FPGA core on the right, the FPGA core as well as the Ares look is definitely more to my liking as far as Super Mario 64 is concerned. And you'll see here watching the Ares footage again, I could basically intercut these between the FPGA core and Ares, and if I didn't tell you what you were looking at, you'd probably be none the wiser that I actually changed sources. So as far as Super Mario 64 is concerned, I definitely recommend playing in Ares versus something like NSO, because both of them are going to be readily accessible if you don't have a MiSTer FPGA, and Ares is going to give you the better version of the game in my opinion. But this is pop quiz time. Leave me a comment down below and tell me, are you watching MiSTer FPGA or are you watching Ares right here? There are a few telltale indicators as to which footage is which, and I'd say if you want to go back and watch MiSTer FPGA versus Ares, you might see a overall brightness difference. Now moving over to F-Zero, a game I said was just not worth playing on NSO because of that frame pacing issue. That's definitely still true. It's probably my least favorite way to play the game. I'm not saying it's the worst way to play the game. I'm not here to make anyone look good or bad. I'm just saying that this never hits for me because it can't maintain that 60 frames per second. If we go over to MiSTer FPGA, it's doing exactly the same thing as real hardware would, and that is fundamentally important when it comes to playing F-Zero. The frame rate, the controls are all married together, and you're going to have a good time or a bad time depending on whether or not you're dropping frames, and on the NSO side of things you are. So the question is, what is Ares doing for F-Zero as well? And in my testing, and I do have a pretty beefy system, I didn't have any frame pacing issues whatsoever in Ares. It did exactly the same thing as the FPGA core did, except on the software emulation side. But do be aware that Ares does require a relatively beefy CPU if you're going to get full performance out of it, because it's trying to be accurate to real hardware, and that means you are going to end up in a situation where if you're running this on a potato, or even maybe a Yukon potato upgrade from a stock potato, you might not be able to get the 60 frames per second all of the time. And again, because it is software emulation, you do need to worry about everything else running on your PC. All those underlying processes and any other apps you might have open like Discord can and will disrupt things every once in a while. Windows is not a perfect operating system, never expect it to be so. But NSO on the left, MiSTer FPGA on the right, and now I'm going to give you guys a taste of Ares, and I'm going to let you listen to the soundtrack as well. Listen and tell me if you hear anything that's out of place, because honestly, the Ares audio has always been very quality to my ear, but maybe you'll notice something. Sounds like F-Zero, plays like F-Zero, looks like F-Zero, and has the same frame rate as F-Zero, so that means as far as F-Zero is concerned, MiSTer FPGA or Ares are going to be great. NSO, definitely not one I would recommend. But moving on to Sin and Punishment, a game I've already shown you guys. We're showing you the Ares footage right now, and we're going to bounce back and forth between NSO, the core, as well as Ares. Because again, Ares is going to replicate the look and feel of a Nintendo 64. All of the different VI pipeline implementations, everything is going to be exactly the same appearance-wise, graphically, as the core. So we're starting it again on NSO, and this was a game when I compared it to MiSTer FPGA. I said it was a draw because the performance was still there, it just had a different graphical look, and you needed to decide whether or not you like that. Because as these bugs fade into those clouds, they look way too readily apparent. They're not blending into that fog like it does here on the MiSTer FPGA core, and like it would on Nintendo 64 hardware. And because this is such a dramatically pretty game and very vibey, you kind of want it to, at least in my opinion, look like it did on original hardware. And that's why Ares is such a good emulator, because it persists in that image. It gives you the exact same look and feel as a real Nintendo 64 or as an FPGA core without having to buy a MiSTer triple stack, because we have moved over to Ares here, and the only difference is that the image is ever so slightly brighter than MiSTer FPGA. But again, I have to go through a capture card on MiSTer versus on my PC where it's OBS, so it could just be a system level situation where the brightness is ever so slightly tweaked. I could have actually match the brightnesses, but I wanted to show you guys the differences as I found them, because they're probably going to be things that you notice too. But outside of the brightness, again, this is another example of a game that works absolutely perfectly on the core, absolutely perfectly on Ares, and absolutely perfectly on NSO as well. You just need to again decide to yourself, what is the visual look you want when you play Sin and Punishment. You can pick pretty much from anything, and you can just run it from there. And sticking with Ares again, this is such a fun game, and that building in the background on MiSTer FPGA on real hardware and on Ares has that softness that you do lose on the NSO side of things. The overall sharpness increase by that internal rendering resolution does change the overall character of the game. I'm not saying for better or worse, I'm just saying it's different, and you get to decide whether or not it's better or worse to your eye. So that's the nice thing about having options. You get to pick which one works best for you, and in this instance I would say Ares is doing everything the core is doing. Looks great, sounds great, plays great, 0 out of 10 complaints there. As we move on to another section in Ares here, get a sense of what those buildings look like in the background, get a sense of the overall motion and cadence going on the screen, and the graphical effects that you're seeing and how they look, because I'm going to do a side-by-side in just a moment of NSO versus the core, and you will see the fundamental difference between the two. On the left on NSO, everything is so sharp in the background, it kind of ends up compressing the image a little bit and making it look like it's at an f22 stop as far as an aperture is concerned. Where on the right on MiSTer FPGA, and the same thing you would get on Ares, you get a softer image, you get more character in the screen, and overall it just looks better. And the Crab Seeker here, as we destroy him on NSO, we can do the exact same thing on Ares, and you can see that again, these are three great options. You get to pick and choose what works best for you. But I don't want to make it seem like NSO is absolutely not the choice and MiSTer FPGA or Ares is, because I will say every time I play Mario Kart 64 on Ares, I get some pretty bad hitching where it seems like the game will freeze for like 3 to 4 frames and then start back up. The audio will get a little bit weird, the game will basically feel like it is not running and it'll start again, and I am using the most updated version of Ares for all of these tests. And the reality is, NSO, just like Ares, just like the core if Robert goes back in and tweaks stuff, are living projects. So just because something like Mario Kart 64 hitches on Ares, and I would consider it not a great way to play, and it does the same thing on NSO, it doesn't mean that it won't be fixed. Although if I had to guess, people will go into Ares and fix it long before Nintendo revisits it on their NSO service on the Switch. So in this instance, it is a situation where the MiSTer FPGA core or original hardware is 100% my way to play Mario Kart 64, because in an arcade racing game, getting that hitching going on is never fun, and I'm sure you've probably seen it a few times already. If you look closely every once in a while, it seems like I just pause the footage and then start it back up in like 1/30th of a second, because it seems to be dropping like 2 to 3 frames every time. Or if we go over to MiSTer FPGA, that never once else happens. The frames are drawing exactly as they should, at the intervals that they should, and we have no problem with it whatsoever. And that is the interesting thing about Ares and NSO as well. They both seem to like to hitch, and I have seen a couple of things where games on NSO and Ares will hitch in the same spots, but it's not consistent enough to say that it is based on the same problem, because in an instance like F-Zero earlier, Ares had absolutely no hitching whatsoever, where NSO was dropping frames like crazy. As we have NSO on the left and MiSTer FPGA on the right, both look really good, both look nice and pleasing to the eye. It is just a difference in style. But again, because Mario Kart has that frame pacing issue, it just isn't the easiest thing to play compared to real hardware. And of course, it's not like we're emulating or playing NSO or playing MiSTer FPGA because we want more of a challenge being able to enjoy our games. We just want to sit down and play them like we normally would. So moving back over to the Ares footage here, there is a hitch in this footage. Take a close look and look at it. Just make sure that you're watching this at 1080p 60 on YouTube, because sometimes what I'm talking about you don't see, because YouTube will default to 30 frames per second, which totally messes up all the examples in some of these tests. So moving forward, do make sure that you hit that little gear icon and pick 1080 60, or else you might miss something, even though I'm talking about it and saying it's on screen right at that moment in time. But Ares is an awesome software emulator. It should be something that you do use. Just do not expect perfection out of it, because some games still have a relatively small issue in that hitching department, and again, you need to have a relatively high test CPU in your system to get full performance out of something like Ares, where obviously MiSTer FPGA, there is no specification. It is just a MiSTer. Don't worry about what CPU you have in there, because you're running it on an FPGA. But that is the results of this three-way head-to-head. This is probably going to be the last comparison I run, but you guys wanted to know more about Ares, and I figured if you were asking, I would make the video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below, but we're done. Pick your poison, go play some Nintendo 64, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.